Chapter 2: Psychological Research. Why is research important? At one time in history, people believed that the earth was flat and the mental illness was caused by possession. People can be very wrong in their ideas about the world when they do not rely on evidence to support their claims. Research is a mandatory process in validating claims. Scientific research is empirical. It is grounded in objective, tangible evidence that can be observed time and time again, regardless of who is observing. Without research, we would only have intuition and groundless assumptions. Through research, we are able to prove certain ideas through study and testing. Psychology is a science, therefore research is required to not only further investigate something, but provide verification and support of the findings. So if we look at the picture on the right-hand side, we'll see a picture of a skull with a hole above the eyes. So some of our ancestors across the world and over centuries believed that trepanation, the practice of making a hole in the skull as shown here, allowed evil spirits to leave the body, thus curing mental illness and other disorders. Use of research information. Advertising campaigns often claim to be based on scientific evidence, when reality is based off of belief. Think critically about claims. What is the expertise of the person making the claim? What might they gain if the claim is valid? Does the claim seem justified given the evidence? What do other researchers think of the claim? So the DARE program continues to be popular in schools around the world despite research suggesting that it is ineffective. So this is a drug abuse resistant education. The process of scientific research: inductive versus deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is results are predicted based on a general premise. So all living things require energy to survive, a premise. Ducks are living things, therefore ducks require energy to survive, conclusion. Inductive reasoning is conclusions are drawn from observations. You see many fruit growing on trees and therefore assume all fruit grow on trees. Scientists form ideas, theories, or hypotheses through deductive reasoning. Hypotheses are then tested through empirical observations, and scientists form conclusions through inductive reasoning. These conclusions lead to new theories and hypotheses, or more broad generalizations. So if we look at the figure on the right-hand side, we see that psychological research relies on both inductive and deductive reasoning. So we have our hypothesis or general premise, to inductive reasoning, to empirical observations, to deductive reasoning, to hypothesis or general premises again. The scientific method. Scientists use inductive reasoning to form theories, which then generate hypotheses. So a theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. A hypothesis is a tentative and testable statement, prediction, about the relationship between two or more variables. It predicts how the world will behave if the theory is correct, usually an if-then statement, if possible, capable of being shown to be incorrect. The scientific method of research includes proposing hypotheses, conducting research, and creating or modifying theories based on results. So if you look at the right-hand side, we have an example of this. So theory, use the theory to form a hypothesis, design a study to test the hypothesis, research, perform the research, observation, create or modify the theory, and we continue. Possible hypothesis. Many of the specifics of Freud's theories, such as his division of the mind into id, ego, and superego, have fallen out of favor in recent decades because they are not falsifiable. However, his views set the stage for much of psychological thinking today, such as the unconscious nature of the majority of psychological processes. Approaches to research: clinical or case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, archival research, longitudinal and cross-sectional research. Clinical or case studies. Clinical or case studies focus on one individual. The studied individual is typically an extreme or unique psychological circumstance that differentiates them from the general public. This allows for a lot of insight into the case, but it is difficult to generalize results to the larger population. So this is an example. Jeannie was studied by psychologists after she was found at the age of 13, having suffered severe abuse and social isolation. Psychologists were interested in the effect social isolation had on her development. Naturalistic observations. Observations of behavior in its natural setting. Naturalistic behavior is generally hidden under scrutiny or observation. Seeing a police car behind you would probably affect your driving behavior. To study the most accurate and genuine behavior, naturalistic observations has proven the most effective. Through naturalistic observations, any feeling of performance or anxiety of the studied individual is eliminated. So there's observer bias, when observations may be skewed to align with observer expectations. So establishment of clear criteria to observe should help eliminate observer bias. Naturalistic observations. Jane Goodall made a career of conducting naturalistic observations of chimpanzee behavior. Surveys. A list of questions that can be delivered in many ways: paper and pencil, electronically, verbally. Surveys can be used to gather a large amount of data from a sample, so this is a subset of individuals, from a larger population. Surveys can be administered in a number of ways, including electronically administered research, like surveys shown here. So the survey shows, "Dear visitor, your opinion is important to us. We would like to invite you to participate in a short survey to gather your opinions and feedback on your news consumption habits. The survey will take approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Simply click the yes button below to launch the survey. Would you like to participate? Yes or no?" Archival research. Uses past records or data sets to answer various research questions or to search for interesting patterns or relationships. A researcher doing archival research examines records, whether archived as a hard copy or electronically. Longitudinal and cross-segmental research. Cross-segmental research compares multiple segments of a population at a single time, such as different age groups. Longitudinal studies in which the same group of individuals is surveyed or measured repeatedly over an extended period of time. Researchers often expect some participants to drop out, particularly in this type of study, and therefore often initially recruit a lot of participants. Attrition, reduction in numbers of research participations as some drop out of the study over time. Longitudinal research like the CPS3 help us better understand how smoking is associated with cancer and other diseases. Analyzing findings. There's correlational research, correlation versus causation, and experimental research. Correlational research. Correlation is the relationship between two or more variables. When two variables are correlated, one variable changes as the other does. Correlation coefficient is a number from -1 to +1, indicating the strength and direction of the relationship between variables, and usually represented by an R. Positive correlation. Two variables change in the same direction, both becoming either larger or smaller. Negative correlation. Two variables change in different directions, with one becoming larger as the other becomes smaller. A negative correlation is not the same thing as no correlation. So scatter plots are a graphical view of the strength and direction of correlations. The stronger the correlation, the closer the data points are to a straight line. So looking at the first one, we have the correlation of positive. It's going up, bottom to top, left to right. The second one, we have a negative correlation, which is top to bottom, left to right. And then the last one, no correlation. So there's no line or shape within that. It's just kind of scattered everywhere. Correlation does not indicate causation. Cause and effect relationship. Changes in one variable cause changes in the other variable. This can be determined only through an experimental research design. Confounding variable. Unanticipated outside the factor that can affect both variables of interest, often giving the false impression that changes in one variable cause changes in the other variable. So looking at an example, as ice cream sales increase, so does the overall rate in crime. A relationship exists between ice cream and crime, but is it correlated or does one cause the other? Correlation does not indicate causation. Does eating cereal really cause someone to be a healthy weight? Illusionary correlations. As well as mistaking correlation for causation, people can also make false correlations. Illusionary correlations, seeing a relationship between two things when in reality no such relationship exists. Confirmation bias, tendency to ignore evidence that disproves ideas or beliefs. Illusionary correlations can be involved in the formation of predetermined attitudes that can lead to disciplinary behavior. Many people believe that a full moon makes people behave oddly. Research demonstrates that this relationship does not exist. Causality, conducting experiments and using the data. The only way to establish that there is a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. A scientific experiment has precise requirements for design and implementation. The experimental hypothesis. Hypotheses can be formulated through 1. Observation, and 2. After reviewing the previous research. Looking at the figure on the right-hand side, we see behavior like this right after a child watches violent television programming might lead you to hypothesize that viewing violent television programs leads to an increase in the display of violent behaviors. Designing an experiment. Experimental and control groups. Experimental group is the participants that experience in the manipulated variable, so the group designed to answer the question. The controlled group is participants that do not experience the manipulated variable. They serve as a basis for comparison and control for chance factors that might influence the results of the study. Experimental manipulation is the only difference between the experimental and control groups, so any differences between the two are due to the experimental manipulation rather than chance. Defining variables and how they will be measured. Operational definition. Description of what actions and operations will be used to measure the dependent variables and manipulate the independent variables. Designing an experiment. Avoiding biases and the placebo effect. Experimental bias. Researcher expectations skew the results of the study. Participant bias. Participant expectations skew the results of the study. Single blind study. Experiment in which the researcher knows which participants are in the experimental group and which are in the control group, but the participants do not. Double-blind study. Experiment in which both the researcher and the participants are blind to the group alignments, so they don't know which one is the control and which one is the experimental group. Placebo effect. People's expectations or beliefs influencing or determining their experience in a given situation. When people are given a pill to improve their mood may increase just because they believe it will. To know if a medication is really having an effect or whether it's us using a placebo effect, the experimental group receive the medication and control group receive a placebo treatment, a sugar pill. This is a double-blind study. Any differences between the groups will be due to the medication. Independent and dependent variables. Independent variable. Variable that is influenced, controlled by the experimenter. Ideally, this should be only important difference between the experimental and controlled group. Dependent variable. Variable that the research measures to see how much effect the independent variable had. So looking at the figure. In an experiment, manipulations of the independent variable are expected to result in changes in the dependent variable. So independent variable is the type of television program viewed. The dependent variable is the violent behavior displayed. So the independent variable influences change in the dependent variable. Selecting participants. Participants, they're subjects of the psychological research. Populations are too large for researchers to include everyone, so samples are used. A sample is a subset of individuals selected from a larger population. The population is the overall group of individuals that the researcher is interested in. Random sample is a subset of larger population in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. This form of sampling is preferred because it is more likely that the selected participants will be a representation of the larger population, whether this be sex, ethnicity, social and economic status, etc. Assigning participants to groups, experimental or control. So there's random assignment, a method of experimental group assignment in which all participants have an equal chance of being assigned to either group. Can be achieved using statistical software or by simply flipping a coin. Prevents systematic differences between groups such as gender or age. Without random assignment, an experiment cannot find a true cause and effect relationship. Any relationship could be due to pre-existing differences between the groups. Random assignments helps to avoid pre-existing systematic differences that any significant differences between the group can be said to be results of the manipulation. Issues to consider. Manipulating variables. As stated, random assignments is required to state causation. Once randomly assigned, each group is then manipulated in some way. However, some experimental designs are more complicated. For example, the effect of sex, male or female, on spatial memory. Sex, an independent variable, cannot be manipulated. Males and females cannot be randomly assigned. This kind of experiment is therefore called a quasi-experimental. A cause and effect relationship cannot be determined from this type of experiment. Ethics. Some questions cannot be answered using experimental design because they would be unethical. For example, the effect of experiencing abuse as a child on levels of self-esteem. You cannot randomly assign participants to receive abuse. This would need to be studied using other approaches such as case studies or surveys. Interpreting experimental findings. Once data has been collected, a statistical analysis is conducted. A statistical analysis determines how likely any differences between experimental groups is due to chance. Psychologists usually discuss results as significant or non-significant. If the odds that the differences occurred by chance are 5% or less, then the results are significant. A true experiment including random assignment, manipulation of the independent variable, and control of the extraneous variables reduce the odds of results occurring by chance. Reporting finding. Research is usually reported in scientific journals, usually aimed at an audience of professionals or scholars. Peer-reviewed journal article. The article is read by several other scientists, usually anonymously, with expertise in the subject matter, who provide feedback regarding the quality of the manuscript before it is accepted for publication. This helps weed out poorly conceived or executed studies, improves articles with suggested revisions, and determines whether the research is described clearly enough to be replicated by other researchers. Replication determines the reliability of the original research design, can include additional measures that expand on the original findings, and provide more evidence to support the original finding or to cast doubt on those findings. Bad science and retraction. The vaccine autism myth. Many peer-reviewed publications publish research making claims that routine childhood vaccines cause some children to develop autism. Since these reports, large-scale research was carried out suggesting that vaccinations are not responsible for causing autism. Many of the original studies have since been retracted. It was found that the leading research in the original study had financial interest in establishing a link between childhood vaccines and autism. Unfortunately, the initial claims were publicized and many people still think vaccinations cause autism. Reliability and validity. Reliability is consistency and reproducibility of the given results. Would the same test give the same results every single time? Do the instruments or tools used to collect the data do so consistent and reproducible ways? When a study involves observations by multiple people, it is important that they all make observations and record them in the same way. Inter-rater reliability. This is a measure of an agreement among observers on how they record and classify a particular event. A reliable, consistent measurement does not always mean that it is measuring something correctly. Validity. The accuracy of a given result in measuring what it is designed to measure. Does a test measure what it is meant to measure? A valid measure is always reliable, but a reliable measure is not always valid. Ethics. Research involving human participants. Research involving human participants must adhere to strict guidelines. The Institutional Review Board, known as the IRB, is a committee of administrators, scientists, and community members that review proposals for research involving human participants. It exists in any research institution that receives federal support for research involving human participants. Generally, IRB must approve research proposals before it can proceed. Informed consent. This is a process of informing a research participant about what to expect during an experiment and then obtaining the person's consent to participate. This includes potential risks of being involved, implications of the research, notification that the participation is voluntary, notification that any data collected will be kept confidential. So an institution's IRB meets regularly to review experimental proposals that involve human participants. Deception. Sometimes deception is necessary to prevent the participants' knowledge of the research question affecting the results as long as it is not considered harmful. Deception. Purposely misleading experiment participants in order to maintain the integrity of the experiment. Debriefing. When an experiment involved deception, participants are told complete and truthful information about the experiment at its conclusion. The Tuskegee syphilis study. Ethical guidelines have not always existed. In 1932, participants were recruited in an experiment studying syphilis in black men. Participants that tested positive were not informed that they had the disease. Although no cure existed at the beginning of the study, a cure was founded in 1947, known as penicillin, but it was not administered to the participants. Many participants unknowingly spread the disease, and many people died. Ethics. Researching involving animal subjects. 90% of psychological research involving animal subjects uses rodents or birds. Animals make good substitutes because many of their basic processes are significantly similar to those of humans. Animals are used when research would be unethical in human participants. Researchers must still aim to minimize pain or distress. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, IACUC, is a committee of administrators, scientists, veterinarians, and community members that review proposals for research involving non-human animals. So this is going to be it for Chapter 2. Thank you for your time, and goodbye.